Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. I'm Jonathan Capehart, Associate Editor for the Washington Post. President Biden heads to Valley Forge today to deliver an address to commemorate tomorrow's third anniversary of the January 6th insurrection. And Donald Trump continues to fight efforts to keep him off primary ballots in 2 states. Joining me now for his debut appearance, Aaron Blake, senior political reporter for the Washington Post. Aaron, welcome to First Look.
Good morning, Jonathan. Thanks for having me.
Sure thing. So, what should we expect from President Biden's speech today?
Well, I think this is about framing up what he hopes will be a choice election in 2024. There is no secret that voters are unenthused about President Biden himself. There is less enthusiasm for him in the Democratic primary, even though he looks like a very significant favorite there. And generally speaking, when you have a presidential incumbent running for reelection, it is about them. That's not necessarily going to be the case this time. We have a former incumbent who has a knack for drawing attention to himself. It's clear the Biden campaign wants to draw attention to Donald Trump and basically remind people of the things that they rejected in 2020. And I think that this speech is really the beginning of a 2024 that is going to be full of a lot of different kinds of efforts to draw attention to the most likely opponent that President Biden's going to face.
How do you think the speech he'll give today fits in with the speech he's set to give on Monday at Mother Emanuel in Charleston, South Carolina, predominantly African American church that was the site of a white supremacist mass shooting in 2015?
Yeah, I think it's all part and parcel. I think there's no secret why these speeches are being given so close together on such significant subjects. The first is obviously an effort to draw attention to the idea that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. The second is part of a growing effort that began with Trump's comments about poisoning the blood, that the Biden campaign was very enthusiastically going after. They want to remind people about the things that they may have forgotten. We have seen polls in recent weeks showing Trump gaining in the general election. There is evidence that people may not have remembered the things that they disliked about Trump back then. And this is really about reminding them of some of the most objectionable episodes that occurred during Trump's presidency and really keeping the focus on him.
Okay, well, let's keep the focus on him and talk about Trump and his multiple and multifaceted legal issues. On Tuesday, he appealed to Maine's Superior Court that state's decision to keep him off the Republican primary ballot. On Wednesday, he appealed Colorado's decision to remove him from that state's Republican primary ballot to the U.S. Supreme Court. You reported this week there's also a chance the High Court could actually affirm the Colorado Supreme Court ruling despite its conservative majority. What's the likelihood of that happening if they even agree to hear this case?
Yeah, look, I don't think that it's necessarily likely, but I think that there are legal experts out there who I spoke to who believe that it's not out of the question. There was a paper that really kind of set off this effort from two very conservative legal scholars that argued that Trump could be disqualified from the ballot for engaging in insurrection under the 14th Amendment. One professor I spoke to, Rick Hasen from UCLA, noted that these professors are the kind of originalist thinkers that some key members of the Supreme Court might look to for guidance on these things. And then also, it's worth noting here that the Supreme Court has actually ruled against Trump a number of times when it comes to legal issues like his claims to immunity, when it comes to things like documents for the January 6th committee. It's not always been an entirely favorable court for him, and he's sometimes attacked members of the court, including Brett Kavanaugh. So certainly the court leans conservative. I don't think that people are necessarily expecting that it will take him off the ballot, but there are a number of different ways this opinion could go that might not be exactly favorable for Donald Trump.
Maine and Colorado stripped Trump from their primary ballots, citing the 14th Amendment, as you mentioned. And now voters in Illinois are petitioning to have Trump removed from that state's primary ballot, citing that he engaged in insurrection. But Aaron, a Washington Post University of Maryland poll about January 6th showed that Republican voters are increasingly supporting Trump's conspiratorial view about what happened that day. But you also write, quote, the events remain a distinct political liability for Trump heading into 2024. Explain.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that the narratives that have been pushed about January 6th, that it wasn't so violent or bad, and that these people were perhaps defending a democracy, that has gained traction on the right. But what we also see in this new post University of Maryland poll is that those views are very much outside of where the majority of Americans are. The majority of Americans believe that Trump probably committed a crime. The majority of Americans believe that January 6th was a very bad thing. And so, like with many things, including the indictments that Trump has faced, we need to separate how this breaks down in the primary from how it could break down in a general election context. And while Trump's kind of rewriting of the narrative of January 6th might help him in a Republican primary and marshal support behind this sense of persecution that he's built, it is still something that cuts against him when it comes to the broader public. Now, that doesn't mean he'll necessarily lose, but it is something that gives a majority of Americans, according to basically all the polls, pause about electing him to the presidency again.
Is Trump's best legal argument that he hasn't yet been convicted of insurrection, making this ballot move premature?
Yeah, there are a few ways that we could get to a conclusion without the Supreme Court deciding whether Trump engaged in insurrection. There's arguing that he hasn't been convicted of insurrection. There's arguing that the 14th Amendment clause at issue here is not self-executing. In other words, Congress needs to pass some kind of a law laying out a process here. And then there's something that a Denver District Court judge found, which is that the 14th Amendment, the language doesn't so clearly identify the president as being subject to this qualification. So there are a number of ways in which the Supreme Court could punt without getting at that kind of central issue. I would imagine that Trump's arguments are going to be focused on those rather than necessarily litigating the insurrection portion of this, because that's a very dicey issue for him to get into. But it's very much up in the air. There are many ways in which this could go, many ways in which the Supreme Court could ultimately handle this, if indeed it does take up the case. But I would add that all these states moving in this direction does kind of increase the onus on the Supreme Court to settle this issue in some way.
Okay, anticipates what I was just about to ask you, but I've got this skeptical eye over something you just said that Trump supporters say and Trump's legal people say that, well, he's not, the president is not directly named in the in the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. But it does say, or any officer of the United States. It strains credulity that someone would think that the president of the United States, the commander in chief, isn't considered an officer of the United States. I would love to know if you've asked the historians you've talked to, whether the argument that the Trump legal folks and his supporters, whether that even holds water.
The experts that I've talked to think that there is a very cogent legal argument that the 14th Amendment does apply to the president. But these things are very rarely litigated in a way that provides a direct answer. And that gives the Supreme Court some latitude to interpret. I would also add that that Denver District Court judge, who initially, before the Supreme Court stepped in, suggested that this didn't apply to Trump, but also that he engaged in insurrection. So, it's a difficult legal issue. But anytime you're dealing with something that hasn't been dealt with, when you have all these unsettled questions, it gives judges an out to not deal with the central issues that you're talking about.
Real quickly, I think you may have addressed this in a previous answer, but the idea that the Supreme Court would allow Minnesota to keep Trump on the ballot, but allow Colorado and Maine to keep Trump off the primary ballot, that they'll let that stand. I I mean, I'm no lawyer, but I seem to think from watching the court, they don't like patchwork policies around the country.
Yeah, it's a dilemma for the court because they could go with a very limited opinion, basically affirming what Colorado did. But other states don't necessarily have the same processes that allow for a challenge like this to take place. That's why this Colorado decision was the first one to succeed, and we saw efforts in Minnesota and Michigan fail. There is a state law in Colorado that allowed voters to challenge somebody before they're placed on the ballot. So the Supreme Court could feasibly say states can decide this for their primary ballots, and then it would be up to the states to have the laws that would allow that and make their own decisions. But I think when you're talking about such an issue of large significance, this is something that is going to come up over and over again. It's something that could come up after Trump would be elected. And the Supreme Court would basically be allowing that to remain undetermined heading into a general election with very big consequences potentially in the future.
Three things that everyone should remember. State elections are governed by state election law. That these lawsuits are about keeping Trump off the Republican primary ballot, not the general election ballot. And a lot of these citizens who are raising these challenges are Republicans. Aaron Blake, senior political reporter for the Washington Post. Thanks for coming to First Look. But before we let you go, we got some exciting news to share with viewers. You are debuting a new newsletter on Monday called The Campaign Moment, and it's the Post's only newsletter solely dedicated to covering the 2024 campaign. You can see, look, that's a nice graphic there, Aaron.
It is, isn't it?
Great news for all of us political junkies. Congratulations, Aaron. Thank you for joining us today. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Jonathan.
All right, time for the roundtable. So let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find Washington Post associate editor Eugene Robinson and Washington Post columnist George Will. George, Happy New Year. Welcome back to First Look.
Glad to be with you.
Happy New Year to you, Jonathan.
All right, let's start with the breaking news this morning. The December jobs report came out. 216,000 jobs created, unemployment rate at 3.7%. If you are the Biden administration, George Will, are you happy?
You're happy with the numbers and unhappy with the fact that the numbers don't seem to be persuading the public. I think I've figured out why this is, Jonathan. Inflation is the big, visible daily reminder of a changed condition. And the way the public thinks about inflation is this: if a box of Cheerios, because of inflation, the cost of it goes up X, they think inflation has not been cured until the box of Cheerios costs minus X. That is, they think inflation, when it recedes, the costs associated with it should recede. Well, that's not how it works, never has, never will. And that's why the president is getting no credit for otherwise quite good numbers on the economy.
Mm-hmm. Gene, what do you think?
I think George is right. Actually, I think it's difficult to persuade people that inflation is coming down when they don't actually see prices coming down, which doesn't happen. You know, wages rise and things even out. But so yes, inflation is down. The job numbers are good. Um, I guess certainly the conventional wisdom is that none of this is particularly breaking through to the voters' consciousness. We'll have to see as the year goes on whether it begins to sink in that actually this is a really pretty good economy or not, and that'll have a lot to do with how the election comes out.
Let's talk about President Biden's speech today, Eugene. One of the themes he's expected to hit today is to ask whether democracy remains, quote, a sacred cause for America, as asserted by George Washington. He will argue it does. But given polling we've seen, is that view widely shared anymore?
Well, you know, there was polling after the 22 elections that seemed to indicate that democracy was an issue on voters' minds, and that it helped turn what was supposed to be a red wave into not even a ripple. So I think there's an element of smart politics here because that does seem to be something that people care about. I think the other part of it, of course, is to make this election as much as possible about Donald Trump. Because if it's about Donald Trump, President Biden thinks that's favorable ground for him to win a re-election on. So if we focus on democracy, focus on Trump.
George, this will be President Biden's fifth speech on democracy since taking office. Do you think he's overstating the case?
Hey, I do think he's overstating the case, and the way he's making the case is not helping him. I mean, his numbers are absolutely awful. In one recent poll, USA Today, and I've forgotten the Suffolk College, I guess, last week had his support among African Americans at, I think, 63%. That's stunning. He got 87% in 2020. Since the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1964, Democratic presidential nominees have averaged 85%. So whatever satisfaction Mr. Biden is getting from saying that he stands like Horatio at the bridge, preventing our democracy from being overrun by the Goths and Visigoths, it's not working. I think the American people in their native calmness say, this country is not that fragile.
Gene, is there any possible way that 60-something percent, only 60-something percent of African Americans in the 2024 election will vote for President Biden?
Well, I'll certainly eat this tie if that happens, Jonathan. I mean, no, I think just a flat no would suffice there, and the number I would wager is going to be certainly around that historical average. So I think that there's that number. I think reflects a lack of enthusiasm about President Biden as a candidate for re-election. You see that lack of enthusiasm among Democrats writ large, but I expect a lot of those voters to come home if and when it comes down to a binary choice. And if that binary choice is against Donald Trump, I think a whole lot of people are going to come home.
George, you wrote a provocative column this week arguing that those worried about a Donald Trump authoritarian presidency returning to the Oval Office should be equally concerned about the current Oval Office occupant. Say what now? Explain. Explain.
Sure. Modern presidents of both parties are characterized by impatience and arrogance, such that they say, look, democracy is about persuasion, but persuasion requires patience, and I'm impatient to do good for the country. Therefore, I'm going to disregard certain things about making appointments and the advice and consent of the Senate. The Supreme Court has had to swat down appendages of the Biden administration, the CDC and others, over an eviction moratorium that it had no power to do. The vaccine mandate that it had no power to order. On student loans, the Supreme Court has swatted down Mr. Biden's attempt to give $400 billion to a minority of American young people and not so young people who have college degrees, but are reliable Democratic voters. And this didn't begin with Biden, it didn't begin with Trump. I do recall President Obama saying over and over and over again he did not have the power to do by executive order what he then turned around and did on immigration. I do not recall people hysterical about the future of democracy and the threat of authoritarianism when Barack Obama made recess appointments when the Senate was not in recess. So there's been a kind of slide away from constitutional ethics on the part of both parties. And the idea that Mr. Trump alone is guilty of this vice is, it seems to me, selective indignation.
Okay, I'm only laughing, George, because it's kind. I mean, I see your argument, but there are a couple things. And Gene, I'm going to bring this question, get your reaction. And I take your point, George, about the impatience of the executive. But But what about that impatience being driven by inaction by Congress? And to your point about DACA, President Obama tried over and over and over again to get Congress to take yes for an answer, and it refused. So, Gene, oh, and by the way, the Senate was in recess in a pro forma fashion. But Gene, your your reaction
Well, I
to George's
look. No, as George points out, and it's not the first time he's pointed it out, this sort of creeping imperial presidency has been creeping for many, many administrations. This is nothing new. He could have written this about any president, really, in my lifetime or in my adult life, in terms of overstepping the Madisonian bounds of the presidency. They've all been doing it. I think in this case, to compare Donald Trump and Joe Biden in that way, he's kind of comparing, apples and cannonballs. I mean, it's not it's the transgressions are very different in kind. And so we're not talking about recess appointments when we talk about Donald Trump. We're talking about someone who illegally tried to hold on to the office of the president after being defeated in a free and fair election, and someone who has announced essentially his intentions to govern in in an autocratic manner, in the sense of autocracy that is different in kind from anything that any prior president has done. So I don't think it's a fair comparison, really. Although I think George's basic point about the creeping presidency, certainly that's valid.
Right.
It doesn't pertain to the Trump Biden comparison.
Right, and George, I want to be clear that to Gene's point, your basic point, I don't quibble with at all, because you do have a strong argument about the imperial presidency. Let's shift gears and talk about the Republican quest for the presidential nomination for 2024. We're 10 days out from the Iowa caucuses. A couple of polls this week showed former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley gaining momentum, narrowly ahead of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis for second place. George, what's fueling Haley's rise, do you think?
I think she's campaigned successfully. I think that in New Hampshire, getting the endorsement of four-term, very popular Governor Chris Sununu helped a lot. Her stumble over the origins and cause of the Civil War caused big waves in Washington, but not, I think, out in the country where people have other things to worry about. She does have a very narrow path to defeating Trump. One is he underperforms in Iowa, which I think is apt to be the case. Iowans have a tradition of late deciding, and people like Rick Santorum and Mike Huckabee and Ted Cruz have benefited from this. Then in New Hampshire, if she comes very close, and even if she wins New Hampshire, then you set up a big showdown in her home field of South Carolina, where if she then outperforms and he underperforms and she perhaps beats him, the question then is the system so front-loaded with primaries and caucuses where winner take all or plurality take most occurs, that Mr. Trump will be wounded but not brought down? We're going to find out. But Nikki Haley, long story short, has a path. It's a narrow one, but it's a real one.
Gene, I would love to know if you think she stands a chance of beating Donald Trump. But last night, during a CNN town hall, Governor Haley was asked about the slavery controversy, And one of the things she said was, I had black friends in South Carolina. I mean, you're from South Carolina.
Yeah.
You're from South
Mhm.
Carolina. Um, I kid. I'm sorry. Does she stand a chance
I
of beating Trump?
Well, okay, George is right. It is an exceedingly narrow path. I think it is almost inconceivable that she beats Trump in Iowa, although, yes, the Iowa caucuses are notoriously difficult to poll, and Iowa caucus goers do decide late, and sometimes they surprise us. From history, would suggest that maybe they're more likely to surprise us by going with someone who's further to the right than we might have expected, and that doesn't necessarily augur well for Nikki Haley there. But I assume Donald Trump is going to win Iowa. That's my assumption. And so, all she kind of has to bet it all on New Hampshire. On way overperforming may not be enough. She may have to beat him in New Hampshire, and then hope that raises her right now pretty dismal prospects in South Carolina. Any polling and my own sort of anecdotal, just talking to people, information suggests that Donald Trump is way ahead in South Carolina, and it will be very difficult for her to beat him there. But she overperforms in New Hampshire. She perhaps overperforms expectations in South Carolina. But where is she then? She still hasn't won anything, and I do think our primary system, especially on the Republican side, is very, very much front loaded. And so if Trump sweeps those first three states, I think it'll be very, very difficult for anyone to stop him, except maybe, maybe 12 jurors somewhere end up stopping him. But I'm not betting a whole lot of money on that, given the pace of
Right.
the legal cases.
So we talked a lot about Nikki Haley and her momentum and can she take him out and overperform and everything. Didn't say a word about Ron DeSantis, Chris Christie, whoever else might still be running. George, why are these folks still running if it is so inevitable and so clear that Donald Trump is going to win this nomination by maybe after Super Tuesday?
Well, Chris Christie has a New Jersey frame of mind, which is to say he's a brawler and he enjoys the fight. And he thinks he's got a righteous cause in trying to bring down Donald Trump. Polls indicate that if he dropped out, a substantial majority of his voters would go to Nikki Haley. So at this point, he just objectively is helping the campaign of the man he's trying to undo, Donald Trump. With regard to DeSantis, people just don't warm up to him. I'm sorry. Someone once said to me, a former senator told me the other day, with regard to DeSantis, if you want people to like you, it helps to like people. And Mr. DeSantis doesn't seem to at this point. So he had every advantage coming in. The more he has campaigned, the more people have recoiled from him. Now that's the market has spoken, political market. It's time for him to leave the stage.
Yeah.
With that, we are going to leave it there. George Will, Gene Robinson, thank you as always for coming to First Look. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Same to you.
All right, and head to WashingtonPostLive.com to find out more information and to register. Once again, I'm Jonathan Capehart, Associate Editor at The Washington Post. Thank you for watching Washington Post Live's First Look.